I remember the weight of the armor before I remembered my own name. Polished plates that caught the light of the Erd tree like fragments of a shattered sun. Each piece fitted to my body by hands I never saw, blessed by voices that spoke words I never understood. The golden sheen was so bright it hurt to look at directly, and I wore it every day, felt its pressure against my shoulders, my chest, my throat. They told us we were chosen. They told us we were the fingers of the greater will made manifest in steel and flesh. They told us the capital would stand forever. I believed them because I had no reason not to. The barracks in Leyndell smelled of oil and old sweat and something else, something I could never quite place, a scent like flowers left too long in a sealed room. We slept in rows, 30 men to a hall, and when the dawn light came through the high windows, it painted everything in that same impossible gold. My bunkmate was a man named Gorvael, broad-shouldered and quiet, who polished his gauntlets every night until they gleamed like mirrors. He never spoke about where he came from. None of us did. Our lives began the day we took the oath, kneeling in the chapel beneath the roots of the Erd tree, feeling something vast and incomprehensible pressing down on us from above. The ceremony had lasted hours. I remember the cold of the stone floor seeping through my knees, remember the way the light filtered down through gaps in the root system overhead, creating patterns that shifted and moved like living things. The priest who administered the oath was an old man whose face I never fully saw, hidden as it was beneath layers of golden cloth. His voice was thin and reedy, but it carried through the chamber with an authority that made my bones ache. He spoke of duty and honor and eternal service to the Golden Order. He spoke of the Erd tree as though it were a living God watching us, judging us, finding us worthy. When he placed the mark upon my forehead, a brand that seared into my flesh with a pain so intense I thought I might faint, I felt something enter me, something that was not quite thought and not quite sensation, but somewhere in between, a presence, a weight, a purpose that was no longer my own. Gorvael had screamed during his branding. I heard it from my position 3 rows back, a sound of pure agony that cut through the ceremonial chanting and the smell of burning flesh. Afterward, when we were assembled in the courtyard for the first time as knights, I looked at his forehead and saw the mark was different from mine. Mine was a simple tree, roots spreading downward. His was the same tree, but with something else, a shape I could not quite make out, like a hand reaching up through the roots from below. I asked him about it once, and he told me to never speak of it again, and there was something in his eyes that made me obey. The patrols were endless. Every morning we assembled in the courtyard. As the sun broke over the outer walls, our captain calling out assignments in a voice that never wavered, never showed doubt. Captain Aldrin was a man who seemed carved from the same stone as the city itself, angular and hard and utterly immovable. He had served for 20 years or so, the stories went, and had never once failed in his duty. His armor bore no scratches, no dents, no signs of wear, despite decades of service. He moved with a precision that was almost inhuman, each gesture calculated, each word measured. When he looked at you, it felt like being examined by something that saw through flesh and bone to the weakness beneath. The eastern ramparts needed watching. The merchant district required inspection. The lower streets had reported shadows moving where no shadows should be. We marched in formation, boots striking stone in perfect rhythm, spears held at identical angles. The sound of it was hypnotic, that endless repetition of footfalls echoing off the golden walls, creating a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat until I could not tell where the march ended and my own body began. The citizens would stop and bow as we passed, their faces turned downward, and I felt something like pride mixed with something else, something that tasted like ash at the back of my throat. I told myself it was honor. The city was beautiful in those early days, or at least I thought it was. The streets were wide and clean, paved with stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Every building seemed to reach toward the sky with a desperate sort of grace, their facades decorated with intricate carvings that depicted scenes I did not understand, trees I had never seen, beasts that could not exist, figures with too many limbs or faces that shifted depending on the angle of viewing. The merchant district was always busy, filled with traders from distant lands, selling goods I could not afford and did not need. Perfumes from the south that smelled of spices I had no names for. Fabrics from the east that felt like water between your fingers. Weapons forged in fires I could not imagine, their blades inscribed with words in languages that predated the Golden Order itself. I bought a knife once, using coin I had saved from 3 months of service. The merchant was a small man with hands that moved too quickly, constantly adjusting his wares, rearranging his display, never quite still. He told me the knife had been blessed by fingers unknown, that it would never dull, never break, never fail me when I needed it most. I paid him what he asked because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there were things in this world that could be trusted to remain constant. I kept that knife in my boot for 5 years, and I never once had cause to use it. And when everything fell apart, I could not remember where I had left it. The patrols took us through every district of the capital, from the highest towers of the royal quarter to the lowest sewers beneath the merchant rows. We were the eyes of the order, constantly watching, constantly vigilant for any sign of corruption or decay. We arrested thieves and broke up fights and stood guard at ceremonies we did not understand. We escorted nobles through dangerous streets and investigated reports of strange noises and inspected every shadow for threats that rarely materialized. It was monotonous work, grinding and thankless, and I took a strange comfort in that monotony. Each day the same as the last, each patrol following the same routes. Each night returning to the barracks to clean my armor and sharpen my blade and prepare to do it all again. Gorvael used to say the monotony was the point, that the order wanted us dulled, ground down into perfect obedient tools. He would say this late at night when the other knights were sleeping, his voice barely above a whisper, and there was always fear in it. Fear that someone might overhear, fear that speaking such thoughts aloud might make them real. I never responded when he said these things. I would lie in my bunk and stare at the ceiling and listen to his breathing gradually slow and deepen as he fell asleep, and I would wonder if he was right, and I would wonder if it mattered. The first sign was the dragon. It came on a Tuesday, though I only remember that because Gorvael had mentioned his sister's birthday, and Tuesdays were when letters arrived from outside the capital. I had been on patrol in the Western District, checking the guard posts along the outer wall, when the sky split open with a sound like reality tearing. One moment there was only blue sky and scattered clouds and the ever-present glow of the Erd tree in the distance. The next moment there was fire everywhere, red and gold and black, consuming the sky itself, and through the flames came something so massive it seemed to defy comprehension. The dragon. I had seen dragons before in tapestries and carvings, stylized representations that made them seem noble and distant and somehow unreal. This was nothing like those images. This was a creature of pure physical reality, scales the color of old copper scarred with age and battle, wings that seemed to tear the air as they moved, eyes that burned with an intelligence that was terrifying in its focused hatred. It moved through the sky with a terrible grace, circling once above the city as though surveying its prey, and then it descended. The impact when it landed shook the entire western quarter. Buildings collapsed under the shockwave, windows shattered in cascading waves of broken glass. People in the streets were thrown from their feet, and those closest to the landing site simply ceased to exist, crushed beneath claws each the size of a man. The dragon opened its mouth and released a torrent of flame that turned stone to slag and flesh to ash. The screaming started immediately, a sound so vast and terrible it seemed to come from the city itself rather than the people dying within it. We ran toward it because that was what we were trained to do, shields raised, prayers on our lips to the Erd Tree and the Golden Order, and whatever else might listen. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on our armor before we even reached the fighting. I could feel my skin cooking beneath the metal plates, smell my own hair singeing, taste smoke and burning meat in every breath. The dragon was already 3 streets deep into the district, carving a path of destruction that left nothing standing. Bodies lay everywhere, twisted and charred, some still moving, their mouths open in silent screams. Captain Aldrin led the charge with a courage that seemed divorced from sanity. He ran directly toward the creature, his sword raised high, his voice lifted in a battle cry that was swallowed by the roar of flames. 20 knights followed him, including Gorvael, including me. We formed a line and we charged, and the dragon looked at us with those terrible ancient eyes, and I saw something in them that might have been amusement. The first knight to reach it drove his spear directly into the dragon's foreleg. The spear shattered. The knight died in the next breath, crushed beneath a claw that moved faster than thought. The second knight tried to dodge and was caught by the tail, sent flying into a building with enough force to leave a crater in the stone. The third managed to land a blow on the creature's flank, and his sword bounced off the scales with a sound like a bell ringing. And then there was fire, and then there was nothing. Gorvael made it farther than most. He was always the strongest of us, the fastest, the most skilled. He ran in low, avoiding the sweeping tail and the grasping claws, and he drove his lance into the soft flesh beneath the dragon's wing with enough force to bury it halfway to the shaft. The dragon roared, a sound that shattered what few windows remained intact, and it turned its full attention on him. I saw Gorvael's face in that moment, saw the realization spreading across his features, saw him understand that he had accomplished nothing except ensuring his own death. The dragon's jaws closed around him, and when they opened again, there was only armor, crushed and empty, falling to the scorched stones below. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs would not respond. I stood there in the middle of that burning street with my sword raised uselessly and watched the dragon continue its rampage. It killed another 5 knights in as many seconds, moving with a terrible efficiency that spoke of experience, of centuries spent perfecting the art of slaughter. Captain Aldrin managed to land a glancing blow across its snout, and the dragon swatted him aside, almost lazily, sending him through a wall. I heard the impact even over the roar of flames. I heard his armor hit stone, and I knew he was dead. The dragon turned toward me. Its eyes met mine, and I felt something break inside my mind, some fundamental certainty about my place in the world and my purpose within it. Those eyes held nothing but contempt, not hatred, not rage, just pure disdain for something so far beneath its notice that killing me would be an act of charity rather than conquest. It opened its mouth, and I saw fire building in its throat, and I finally found the strength to move. I ran. I dropped my sword and my shield, and I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my armor clanging with every step, my lungs burning, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I heard the roar of flames and the sound of more buildings collapsing and the screams of people dying, but I did not look back. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed in an alley 3 districts away, gasping for air, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and terror, and the shame was worse than the fear. I had abandoned my brothers. I had fled in the face of the enemy. I had proven myself a coward. There was no redemption, no excuse that would suffice. A knight of Leyndell did not. A servant of the Golden Order did not. And yet I had done both, and the weight of that knowledge was heavier than any armor. I lay in that alley for hours as the sun moved across the sky and the sounds of battle gradually faded into an awful silence. When I finally found the courage to stand and make my way back toward the barracks, the Western District was gone, not damaged, not ruined, gone. An entire section of the city had been reduced to ash and rubble and scorched stone, a blackened scar that stood out against the golden architecture like an accusation. Bodies lay everywhere, burned beyond recognition. The dragon was gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only devastation in its wake. I found Captain Aldrin's body half buried in debris. His armor was crushed almost flat, gold plate compressed into twisted sculpture. His face was surprisingly intact, eyes open, staring at nothing. I knelt beside him and tried to close his eyes, but they would not stay shut, and I took that as a sign, a judgment. I left him there and continued toward the barracks, stepping over bodies I recognized and bodies I did not, my mind numb, my thoughts moving through sludge. The courtyard was filled with survivors, perhaps 30 knights out of the 200 who had been stationed in Leyndell. They stood in loose groups, their armor blackened and dented, their weapons gone or broken, their eyes hollow with shock. No one spoke. What was there to say? We had been tested and found wanting. The Golden Order had promised us protection and delivered only death. The Erd tree still glowed in the distance, beautiful and untouchable, and I felt something crack inside my chest. A new captain was appointed the next morning, a man named Vargas who I had never noticed before despite serving alongside him for years. He was thin and pale, his voice uncertain, his movements tentative. He gave orders, but they sounded like questions. We were to return to our patrols. We were to maintain order. We were to report any further sightings of dragons or other threats. We were to act as though nothing had changed, when everything had changed, when hundreds were dead, and an entire district lay in ruins, and we all knew, with absolute certainty, that if the dragon returned, we would die just as quickly as those who had already fallen. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to remove my armor and walk away and never look back. But I had nowhere else to go. This was all I knew. This was all I was. So I nodded along with the others, and I strapped on my dented armor, and I picked up a new sword from the armory, and I went back out into the streets to patrol a city that no longer believed in us. The citizens had changed. They no longer bowed when we passed. They watched us with eyes that held questions we could not answer, accusations we could not refute. Some spat on the ground as we walked by. Others simply turned away, their contempt more eloquent than any words. Children who had once waved and smiled now hid behind their mothers' skirts, staring at us like we were monsters wearing human skin. And perhaps we were. Perhaps that was all we had ever been. The patrols became unbearable. Every street held memories of the attack. Every intersection was marked by bloodstains that would not wash away, no matter how much rain fell. The Western District remained abandoned, too dangerous to enter. The rubble unstable and filled with corpses we lacked the manpower to recover. The smell of decay spread through the surrounding areas, sweet and thick and inescapable. I would return to the barracks each night with that smell clinging to my armor, my hair, my skin, and no amount of washing could remove it. Gorvael haunted my dreams. Not the living man I own, but something wearing his face, his armor crushed and empty, his eyes replaced by flame. He would stand at the foot of my bunk and stare at me in silence, his mouth moving as though trying to speak, but no sound. Sometimes I would wake and find myself standing in the middle of the barracks with no memory of how I got there, my hands reaching out to my throat raw from screaming. The other knights stopped sleeping near me. They moved their bunks to the far end of the hall, and pretended not to notice when I woke screaming in the dark. The second sign was the roots. They started appearing 3 weeks after the dragon attack, first in the lower districts, then spreading upward through the city like a slow infection. Pale roots as thick as a man's torso, pushing up through the cobblestones, cracking foundation stones, growing up walls and through windows. They moved with an almost imperceptible slowness, each day advancing only inches, but they never stopped, never retreated, never showed any sign of weakness. The smell was overwhelming. That same flower scent from the barracks, but amplified beyond endurance, so strong it made my eyes water and my throat close. It was sweet and cloying and wrong, like perfume poured over rotting meat. The citizens began to complain of headaches, of nausea, of strange dreams filled with golden light and whispered voices. Some claimed the roots were holy, a blessing from the Erd tree itself. Others said they were a curse, a punishment for some collective sin we had committed without knowing. Captain Vargas ordered us to cut them back. We tried. We spent days hacking at those pale roots with swords and axes, and it was like attacking stone. The blades would bite into the surface perhaps an inch before stopping, and no matter how hard we struck, we could not penetrate deeper. The roots did not bleed or leak sap or show any sign of damage. They simply absorbed our attacks and continued growing, and by the next morning they would have spread past the point we had cut, rendering our efforts meaningless. I was part of a detail sent to investigate the origin point of the roots, a location in the lower districts where witnesses claimed they had first seen the growth emerging. We descended through winding streets that grew progressively narrower and darker, the buildings pressing closer together, blocking out the light of the Erd tree overhead. The smell grew stronger with each step, that sickly, sweet odor mixed now with something else, something that reminded me of the dragon's flames, of burned flesh and melted stone. The origin point was a plaza that had once been a market square. Now it was completely overgrown, the cobblestones invisible beneath layers of pale roots that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, casting everything in sickly green light. At the center of the plaza was a hole in the ground, a perfectly circular opening perhaps 10 feet across, and from this hole emerged the thickest root of all, massive and gnarled, its surface covered in strange protrusions that might have been growths or might have been something else, something deliberately shaped. I approached the edge of the hole and looked down. Darkness, absolute and complete, swallowing my torchlight as though light itself could not exist in that space. I could hear something from below, a sound like breathing, but too deep, too slow. Each inhalation lasting minutes. The other knights refused to go closer, standing at the edge of the plaza with their weapons drawn, their faces pale with fear. I knelt beside the hole and reached out to touch the massive root. The moment my fingers made contact, I felt something surge through me, a presence vast and alien and utterly inhuman. Images flooded my mind. The city as it had been centuries ago, smaller, built with different architecture, worshipping different gods. The coming of the Erd tree, its roots spreading through the earth, consuming everything they touched, transforming the land itself into something new. The founding of the Golden Order, built on bones and blood and forgotten oaths, and beneath it all, something older, something that had been there before the Erd tree, before the city, before humanity itself, something that was waking up. I jerked my hand away and stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The other knights caught me before I fell into the hole. They asked what I had seen, but I could not find words to describe it. How do you explain infinity to someone who has only ever known walls? How do you describe the feeling of being observed by something so vast that your entire existence is less than a mote of dust in its perception? We returned to the barracks and I reported what I had found to Captain Vargas. He listened in silence, his face growing progressively more pale, and when I finished he told me to never speak of it again. The hole was to be sealed, the plaza was to be declared off-limits, the roots were to be ignored. We were to continue our patrols and maintain order and pretend that nothing was wrong, even as the city slowly suffocated beneath a growth we could not stop and did not understand. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand action, explanation, anything but this passive acceptance of doom, but I saw in his eyes the same hollow resignation I felt in my own chest, and I knew there was no point. We were powerless. We had always been powerless. The armor and the oaths and the golden gleam were all just theatre, a performance for citizens who needed to believe someone was in control, even when control was a beautiful lie. The roots continued to spread. Within a month, they covered half the lower districts. Within 2 months, they had reached the merchant quarter. People began to evacuate, fleeing the capital for smaller towns and villages where the roots had not yet appeared. The population dropped from hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. The streets grew empty. The markets closed. The city began to die, slowly, inevitably, strangled by something that grew from below while the Erd tree shone serenely above, indifferent to our suffering. The third sign was the madness. It started with small things: knights missing formations, weapons left unattended, orders forgotten or ignored. Then it escalated. A patrol of 5 men went missing in the eastern quarter during a routine inspection. We searched for 3 days, combing every street, every building, every alley. We found them in the end, huddled together in a narrow lane near the merchant district, their armor removed and stacked in neat piles beside them. They were whispering to each other in voices too low to hear, their eyes wide and unblinking, their pupils dilated so far the iris was barely visible. Their hands moved in strange patterns in the air, tracing symbols I did not recognize, shapes that hurt to look at directly. When we tried to speak to them, they did not respond. When we touched them, they flinched away as though burned. When we tried to move them, they began to scream. The sound was inhuman. It started low, almost a moan, then rose in pitch until it felt like nails being driven into my skull. 2 of my fellow knights dropped their weapons and fled, their hands clamped over their ears, their faces twisted with pain. The rest of us endured, though it took every ounce of will I possessed not to follow them. We bound the mad knights with rope and carried them back to the barracks, and they screamed the entire way, that piercing, unending wail that echoed off the golden walls until it felt like the city itself was crying out in agony. They were taken somewhere. A facility beneath the palace, we were told. A place where they could be cared for and studied and perhaps cured. We never saw them again. No one spoke about what had happened to them. It became one of those topics that caused conversation to die when mentioned, that made knights look away and find suddenly urgent tasks requiring their attention elsewhere. But it did not stop. More knights began to show symptoms: strange behavior, erratic patrols, speaking in languages no one recognized. Some would stand frozen in place for hours, staring at nothing, and when they finally moved again, they had no memory of the lost time. Others would become violent, attacking their brothers with a ferocity that seemed divorced from reason or sanity. We had to lock them in the armory until they could be transferred to that facility beneath the palace, and their screaming kept the entire barracks awake through long nights, filled with sounds that belonged in nightmare. I began to notice changes in myself, small things at first, gaps in my memory, hours I could not account for. I would be on patrol in one district and suddenly find myself in another with no recollection of traveling between them. I would be speaking to another knight and realize mid-sentence that I had no idea what I was saying or why. My dreams became increasingly vivid and strange, filled with images of the Erd tree burning and cities I had never seen and faces that were almost familiar but never quite resolved into recognition. The mark on my forehead, the brand I had received during my oath ceremony, began to ache. A dull, persistent pain that never fully went away, sometimes fading to a background throb, sometimes flaring into sharp agony that made my vision white out. I would press my fingers to it and feel heat radiating from the scar, and sometimes I swore I could feel movement beneath the skin, as though something was growing inside my skull. Captain Vargas disappeared one night without explanation. His armor was found neatly arranged in his quarters, his sword laid across it, but he was gone. No note, no sign of struggle, just absent. No replacement was appointed. We simply continued without leadership, each night doing what seemed right in the moment, our patrols becoming increasingly random and ineffective. The city continued its slow collapse. The roots now covered almost every surface in the lower districts, great masses of pale growth that pulsed with that sickly green light. Buildings were being pulled down by their weight, walls cracking and crumbling as the roots pushed through. The citizens who remained had a haunted look, their eyes constantly darting toward shadows, their movements furtive and desperate. Crime exploded, murders, thefts, violence of every kind. We tried to respond, but we were too few, too scattered, too lost in our own dissolving reality. I found myself returning to that plaza with the whole more often than I should. It was off-limits, dangerous, but I was drawn there by something I could not name or resist. I would stand at the edge of that circular opening and stare down into the darkness and feel that vast presence regarding me with what might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. The breathing sound had grown louder, each inhalation now clearly audible, each exhalation accompanied by a wind that smelled of earth and rot and ancient things that had never seen light. One night I saw something move in the darkness, a flash of pale flesh, a suggestion of limbs too long and too numerous, a glimpse of eyes that reflected my torchlight with colors that should not exist. I stumbled back from the edge and ran, my heart hammering, my mind refusing to process what I had witnessed. When I reached the barracks, I found I had lost 3 hours somewhere between the plaza and safety. The sun had set and risen and set again, and I had no memory of the passage of time. The dreams were no longer just dreams. I would close my eyes and find myself in the plaza, standing at the edge of the hole, and something would be climbing out. Something massive and terrible and wrong, its form constantly shifting, never quite resolving into a shape my mind could comprehend. It would reach for me with appendages that were sometimes hands, sometimes roots, and sometimes just darkness given form, and it would touch my forehead, right where the brand sat, and I would feel myself coming apart, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm, my sense of self dissolving into something larger and colder and utterly inhuman. I would wake, screaming, to find the other knights standing around my bunk, their faces filled with pity and fear. They stopped trying to comfort me. They stopped asking if I was all right. They knew the answer. We all knew the answer. We were all going mad, some faster than others, all following the same inevitable path toward whatever waited for us in the darkness beneath the city. The fourth sign was the silence. It happened gradually, so slowly I almost did not notice. The sounds of the city began to fade. First, the distant noises, the calls of merchants and the laughter of children, and the general hum of human activity. Then closer sound, the footsteps of people passing in the street, the conversations in neighboring buildings, the sounds of my fellow knights moving through the barracks. Until one morning, I woke and realized I could hear nothing at all except my own breathing and the beating of my own heart. I sat up in my bunk and looked around. The barracks was empty, every bunk but mine, every suit of armor gone. I called out, and my voice sounded flat and dead, swallowed by a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. I walked through the halls, calling names, and heard only echoes that died too quickly, as though the walls themselves were absorbing sound. I went to the courtyard, and it was deserted, the training dummies standing in neat rows, the weapons racks full, but no people anywhere. I walked through the streets of Upper Leyndell and saw no one. The buildings were all intact. The roots had not yet reached this high, but there were no signs of life, no lights in windows, no smoke from chimneys, no movement except the wind pushing papers and leaves along empty streets. The silence was so profound it made my ears ring. I shouted as loud as I could, and the sound seemed to travel only a few feet before being cut off, absorbed by something I could neither see nor understand. I found evidence of rapid evacuation, doors standing open, meals left half-eaten on tables, carts abandoned in the middle of streets, but no bodies, no signs of struggle or violence, just the sense that everyone had simply ceased to exist in the same instant, vanished like breath on glass. I walked for hours through that ghost city, my footsteps the only sound, and gradually I began to understand that I was completely alone. The Erd tree still burned in the distance, that impossible golden light undiminished by absence or despair. I realized I hated it with a purity of emotion I had never felt before, so intense it was almost exhilarating. Hated it for being beautiful while everything else fell apart. Hated it for promising protection it never delivered. Hated it for the weight it had placed on my shoulders, the armor I could not remove, the duty that had consumed my entire life and given me nothing in return but this moment, standing alone in an abandoned city, wearing the colors of a lie. I started walking toward the tree. I did not know what else to do. Every other purpose had been stripped away. Every other duty had revealed itself as meaningless. All that remained was that light, and my hatred of it, and the need to confront the source of all the beautiful lies I had been told. The walk took days, or perhaps it took hours. Time had become strange, elastic, no longer moving in the straight line I was accustomed to. The sun would rise and set and rise again in what felt like minutes, or I would walk for what felt like hours, only to realize the shadows had not moved at all. The roots grew thicker as I descended through the city toward the Erd tree's base, covering everything now, pulsing with that green light that made my head ache and my stomach churn. I passed through districts I had patrolled 1,000 times, and they were unrecognizable, transformed into alien landscapes of pale growth and crumbling stone. The merchant quarter was completely overgrown, buildings reduced to vague shapes beneath masses of roots. The eastern district had collapsed entirely, creating a canyon of rubble through which the roots grew like veins. The western district, where the dragon had struck, was now a forest of those pale tendrils, reaching toward the sky as though grasping for something just out of reach. And everywhere, in the spaces between the roots, I saw them. The other night, my brothers. They were standing in formation as though waiting for orders that would never come, their armor tarnished and broken, their weapons hanging loosely from hands that no longer gripped with intention. Their faces were slack and empty, eyes open but unseeing, mouths slightly agape. They did not move as I approached. They did not react when I spoke their names. They simply stood there, silent and still, and I realized they were dead. All of them. Every knight who had served in Leyndell. Hundreds of us standing in perfect formation, held upright by the roots that had grown through our bodies, entering through the gaps in our armor, pushing through flesh and bone, binding us to the stone beneath our feet. I could see the roots moving beneath their skin, creating patterns of raised flesh that pulsed with that sickly green light. Their armor had fused with their bodies, metal and flesh becoming a single unified thing, gold plate growing from skin like natural carapace. I found Gorvael among them. He stood in the second rank, his position the same as it had always been, his lance still gripped in one hand, though the hand itself was now more root than flesh. His face was peaceful, almost serene, and I envied him that peace. Whatever had happened to him had already happened. His torment was over. Mine was just beginning. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to escape this necropolis city before I joined the ranks of the standing dead. But where would I go? The capital was all I knew. This duty was all I was. And beneath the fear and horror was something else, something that felt almost like relief. The weight was finally going to be lifted. The armor was finally going to be... I would finally be free of the burden of pretending any of this had ever mattered. I took my place in the formation. I stood among the dead and raised my eyes to the Erd tree and waited. I did not have to wait long. The roots beneath my feet began to move, sliding across the stone with a sound like whispers, and then they were touching my boots, curling around my ankles, finding the gaps in my armor with a precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose. I felt them enter my flesh, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming, but also strangely distant, as though happening to someone else, to some version of me that still believed pain mattered. The roots climbed higher, wrapping around my legs, pushing through the joints in my armor, entering my body through every available opening. I could feel them inside me, spreading through my muscles, wrapping around my bones, growing through organs I no longer needed. My heartbeat began to slow, each pulse growing fainter, more irregular. My breathing became shallow, then stopped altogether, but I found I did not need air. The roots were providing everything now, feeding me with nutrients drawn from the earth and from the Erd tree itself, sustaining this new form of existence that was neither life nor death, but something in between. The pain faded into numbness. The numbness faded into nothing. I was aware but not conscious, existing but not living. My thoughts grew slow and strange, no longer following linear paths but branching and connecting in ways that made sense in the moment but dissolved when I tried to examine them. I could feel the other knights around me, sensed their presence not as individuals but as nodes in a vast network, all of us connected by the roots that bound us, all of us part of something larger than ourselves. The Erd tree filled my vision, not just the physical trunk, but something beyond, something that existed in dimensions my human mind had never been able to perceive. I saw it as it truly was, not a tree, but a parasite, its roots spreading through reality itself, consuming and transforming everything they touched. I saw the Golden Order not as a system of law and justice, but as a mechanism of control, a tool forged to keep humanity docile and compliant, while the tree fed on their faith and their suffering in equal measure. I saw the gods not as beneficent rulers, but as architects of a prison so beautiful most people never realized they were trapped. And I saw myself, all the versions of myself stretching back through time. The boy I had been before the oath, his name lost, his face already fading from memory. The young knight proud in his new armor, believing in duty and honor and eternal service. The soldier who had run from the dragon, shame burning brighter than any flame. The broken thing standing at the edge of a hole in the world, feeling infinity regard him with indifference. All of these selves existed simultaneously now, layered on top of each other like poorly shuffled cards, and none of them were real. They were all just stories I had told myself to make sense of a reality that had never made sense, masks worn to hide the fundamental emptiness at my core. The roots reached my chest and I felt my heart stop completely. Not dying, but simply ceasing, no longer necessary. The roots reached my throat and my breath stilled, the last whisper of air leaving my lungs with a sound like surrender. The roots reached my face, sliding across my skin, entering through my mouth and nose, pushing behind my eyes. My vision began to change, colors shifting into spectrums I had no names for, shapes revealing geometries that should not exist in three-dimensional space. I saw the city as it truly was, not a collection of buildings and streets, but a living organism, every stone and beam and tile connected by invisible threads of purpose and design. I saw how the dragon attack had been allowed to happen, how it had served a function in the great pattern, culling the weak and the proud and the ones who might have resisted what was coming. I saw how the roots were not an invasion but a reclamation, the Erd tree simply taking back what had always belonged to it. I saw how every knight who had ever served in Leyndell had been chosen not for their strength or skill, but for their susceptibility, their willingness to believe in something larger than themselves, their desperate need to belong to a purpose that would give their meaningless lives meaning. And I saw what waited in the darkness beneath the city, the thing that had been there before the Erd tree, before the Golden Order, before humanity crawled out of whatever primordial swamp had birthed it. A presence so vast and old and alien that comprehending even a fraction of it threatened to shatter what remained of my sanity. It was not evil. Evil implied intention, choice, morality. This thing existed beyond such concepts. It simply was, had always been, would always be, eternal and unchanging and utterly indifferent to the brief flicker of consciousness that constituted human existence. The Erd Tree was its prison, the Golden Order was its cage, and the cage was failing. The roots that bound the city were not spreading from the tree, but toward it, drawn by that ancient presence as it slowly, inevitably, impossibly pushed its way back into a reality that had tried to forget it existed. We knights were not guardian. We were anchors, our bodies bound to the stone, our faith binding us to the tree, our suffering feeding the system that kept that thing contained for just a little longer, but not forever. Nothing lasted forever, not the Erd Tree, not the Golden Order, not even that ancient darkness. Everything decayed eventually, everything fell apart, and we were living through the moment of collapse, the instant when one age ended and another began, when the beautiful lie finally gave way to the terrible truth underneath. The roots reached my eyes and my vision went dark. Not the darkness of blindness, but something deeper, more profound. The darkness of the space between stars, the darkness of the void before creation. The darkness that exists in the gaps between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments that constitute existence. I fell into that darkness and I kept falling, and there was no bottom, no end, just infinite descent into nothing, and then I stopped falling. I was standing again, or something that felt like standing, in a space that felt like the plaza with the whole, but infinitely larger. The darkness was absolute, but I could sense shapes moving within it, vast forms that shifted and flowed like water, like smoke, like ideas given physical presence. The breathing sound surrounded me, coming from everywhere and nowhere, each inhalation pulling at my substance, each exhalation pushing me away. Something spoke, not in words but in sensations, impressions, concepts that crashed into my mind like waves breaking on a shore. It told me everything and nothing. It showed me the history of the world in images that lasted microseconds and contained centuries. It explained the purpose of the Erd Tree, the Golden Order, the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth that constituted reality as humans understood it. It showed me how small I was, how insignificant, how utterly meaningless in the vast scope of time and space and possibility. And then it showed me the alternative, the world without the cage, the reality that would exist when that ancient presence finally broke free of its bonds and spread across the land like a flood. Not destruction, not apocalypse, just transformation. Everything that existed would continue to exist, but in a different form, subject to different laws, operating on different principles. Humanity would not end. It would simply become something else, something without the need for beautiful lies or golden armor or duties that ground souls into dust. I should have felt horror. I should have felt despair. Instead, I felt relief. After so long carrying the weight, after so many years pretending the armor meant something, after a lifetime of service to a lie, the prospect of transformation felt like coming home. Whatever I would become could not be worse than what I had been. Whatever waited in the darkness could not be more terrible than the light I had served. The vision faded, the darkness receded. I found myself back in my body, still standing in formation among the dead, the roots still wrapped through my flesh, still binding me to the stone and the tree and the endless golden lie. But something had changed. I was no longer alone in my mind. Other presences moved through my thoughts, the consciousness of my fellow knights, all of us connected now, all of us sharing the same awareness, the same understanding, the same terrible knowledge. Gorvael was there. I recognized the shape of his thoughts, the particular way he processed information, the dry humor that had survived even death and transformation. He showed me what had happened to him when the dragon's jaws closed. The instant of pain followed by sudden clarity, the realization that death was not an ending, but a transition, the moment he understood that everything we had believed was backwards. The dead were not lost, the living were. Captain Aldrin was there, his consciousness sharp and precise even now, still trying to maintain order in the chaos, still attempting to fulfill duties that no longer applied to our condition. He showed me his final moments, crushed beneath rubble, feeling his body break, and the relief that came with it. The weight lifting, the armor finally removed, the duty finally completed, not through success, but through ultimate failure. Captain Vargas was there, his presence weak and fading, his consciousness unraveling like thread pulled from cloth. He showed me the night he disappeared, walking into the lower districts, drawn by something he could not resist, entering the plaza with the whole, standing at the edge and simply stepping forward into darkness. Not suicide, not escape, just acceptance, the logical conclusion to a life spent serving something that did not exist, and others, hundreds of others, every knight who had ever worn the golden armor and taken the oath and believed in the lie. We were all here now, all connected, all part of this vast network of suffering and understanding. We shared memories, experiences, the accumulated knowledge of centuries of service. We saw through each other's eyes, felt through each other's senses, thought with each other's minds. Individuality became meaningless. The boundaries between self and other dissolved. We were becoming something new. Days passed, or weeks, or months. Time had lost all meaning. The sun rose and set in its endless cycle, and I watched without caring. The roots continued to grow, spreading through the city, consuming everything, transforming stone and steel and flesh into more of themselves. The Erd tree still glowed overhead, but its light seemed dimmer now, flickering like a candle in wind, and I understood. It was dying. The cage was failing. The ancient presence was rising. I tried to remember why I had cared, why any of it had mattered. The patrols, the duty, the honor, the service. They were words without meaning, concepts that applied to a version of myself that no longer existed. That version had died when the dragon came, or when the roots appeared, or when the madness took hold, or perhaps much earlier, the moment I knelt in the chapel and accepted the brand that marked me as property of something that did not deserve worship. The golden light continued to fade, the roots continued to grow, and standing in formation among the dead, I waited for whatever came next, with something that might have been anticipation, or might have been dread, or might have been nothing at all, just the hollow absence where emotion used to live. The first crack appeared in the Erd tree on a morning that felt like any other. A sound like thunder rolling across the sky, and suddenly there was a dark line running up the trunk, a fissure that leaked not sap, but something else, something that looked like smoke, made liquid, black and oily and wrong. The crack spread quickly, branching like lightning, covering the surface of the tree with a network of darkness that pulsed with anti-light, shadows that somehow shone brighter than the gold they consumed. The network of consciousness that connected all the nights began to vibrate with something that might have been fear or might have been excitement. We felt the change rippling through us, through the roots that bound us, through the very stone beneath our feet. The ancient presence was moving, rising, breaking free after millennia of imprisonment. The moment we had all been serving toward, without knowing, it was finally arriving. The Erd tree began to collapse, not falling like a normal tree, but unmaking itself, the golden wood dissolving into particles that hung in the air like dust, like ash, like the remains of burned faith. The light that had shone for so long, the beautiful lie that had sustained entire civilizations was going out, and in its place came darkness, spreading from the roots of the tree outward, consuming the city, transforming everything it touched. I felt it reach me, the darkness. It moved through the roots into my body, displacing whatever had been there before, filling me with itself, cold. Not the cold of ice or winter, but the cold of the void, of spaces between stars, of the absence of heat or light, or life as I had understood it. My thoughts began to fragment, breaking apart like ice under pressure, reforming into patterns that made sense according to different logic, different rules, different fundamental laws of existence. The armor fused completely with my body. Metal and flesh became indistinguishable, gold plate growing from my skin like scales, like bark, like the carapace of insects I had seen in my childhood dream. My face changed, features smoothing away, becoming a mask of gold that could not smile or frown or express anything human. My hands fused with my weapon, fingers merging with the hilt, until sword and self were one unified thing. Around me, the other knights were changing too. Gorvael's form stretched upward, his armor elongating into something that resembled a tree more than a man, his arms spreading into branches, his legs rooting deep into the stone. Captain Aldrin collapsed inward, his body compacting, compressing, becoming a single point of dense matter that pulled light toward itself and released nothing. Captain Vargas simply dissolved, his substance spreading into the roots around him, his consciousness fragmenting into 1,000 smaller pieces that each retained some spark of awareness, but no longer constituted a unified self. The transformation continued. Hours or days or years, impossible to measure when time itself was becoming fluid and strange. I watched my legs merge with the stone beneath me, watched my spine extend downward like a root system, watched my rib cage expand outward to accommodate organs that had never existed in human anatomy. Pain was a distant concept, something that applied to flesh that I no longer possessed. What I felt instead was wrongness, a deep, fundamental sense that I was becoming something that should not exist, that violated laws more basic than physics or biology, but also rightness, a sense that this had always been my destiny, that every moment of my life had been leading toward this transformation, that the boy I had been and the knight I had become were just preliminary stages in a metamorphosis that was only now reaching completion. The weight of the armor had prepared me for this. The years of duty had trained my mind to accept subordination to forces I did not understand. The oath I had taken had marked me as raw material, to be shaped into whatever the ancient presence required. The city was fully transformed now. Every building had been consumed by roots or collapsed into rubble. Every street was covered in that pulsing pale growth. Every citizen was gone, fled, or dead, or transformed into something no longer recognizable as human. Leyndell, the eternal capital, the golden jewel of the Golden Order, had become a necropolis, a monument to hubris, a testament to the futility of believing beautiful lies could last forever. The ancient presence emerged from the hole in the plaza. I could not see it with eyes that no longer functioned as eyes, but I could sense it, feel its vastness pressing against reality like a weight too heavy for space to contain. It was not a creature or an entity or a being in any sense I could comprehend. It was more like a force of nature, like gravity or entropy, something fundamental and unchained and utterly without mercy or malice or any emotion at all. It spread across the city like fog, like darkness, like the shadow cast by something so large it blocked out the sky. Where it touched, things changed. Stone flowed like water. Air became solid. Light bent in impossible directions. The laws that governed reality were being rewritten according to different principles, older principles, rules that predated the Golden Order by eons. And we knights, we guardians, we anchors, we were the medium through which this transformation occurred. I felt my consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of my body, spreading through the root network, connecting with every other transformed knight, with every root and stone and particle of ash that had once been the capital. I was no longer just myself. I was part of something vast and distributed and utterly alien to human understanding. My memories became confused with others' memories, my thoughts tangled with others' thoughts. The borders of selfhood dissolved entirely until there was no me, no I, just a single, unified awareness distributed across what had once been a city. Through this expanded consciousness I saw everything. The lands beyond Leyndell, still golden, still ordered, still believing the lie. The Erd Tree's light still shone there, though weaker now, flickering. The Golden Order still held, though its foundations were cracking. People still believed, still prayed, still served duties they did not understand. But it would not last. The transformation spreading from Leyndell would reach them eventually. The ancient presence was free now, unchained, and it would not stop until everything had been remade according to its nature. I saw the tarnished, those exiles who had been cast out, returning to claim grace that no longer existed. I saw demigods warring over fragments of power that meant nothing now that the source was dead. I saw factions and conspiracies and grand plans all rendered meaningless by the simple fact that the world they were fighting over had already ended. They just did not know it yet. I saw other lands, other kingdoms, other civilizations that had risen and fallen under the Erd Tree's light. All of them eventually consumed, all of them transformed, all of them joining the network of consciousness that now constituted reality as it truly was, stripped of illusion and pretense and beautiful lies. This had happened before. This would happen again. The ancient presence did not conquer or destroy. It simply was, and anything that existed in its presence eventually became part of it. And I saw the future, or something like future, time having become strange enough that past and present and yet to be were all simultaneously accessible. I saw the lands completely transformed, unrecognizable, operating on principles that would seem like magic or madness to anyone who remembered the old laws. I saw humanity adapted to this new reality, their bodies and minds reshaped, no longer quite human, but not quite other either, existing in that liminal space between categories. I saw civilizations rise and fall according to different patterns, different cycles, built on foundations that shifted and changed like sand. And I saw that eventually, impossibly far in the future, this too would end. The ancient presence would be bound again or displaced by something even older, even stranger. A new order would arise, perhaps another golden order, or perhaps something completely different. The cycle would begin again. Beautiful lies would be told, duty would be demanded, suffering would be required, and new knights would take oaths they did not understand to serve purposes that did not care whether they lived or died. This knowledge should have filled me with despair. Instead, I felt nothing. Emotion was a function of individuality, and individuality was something I no longer possessed. I was part of the network now, part of the transformation, part of the ancient presence itself. What I had been was gone. What I had become was eternal and empty and utterly without meaning beyond pure existence. Time continued its strange flow. The seasons turned, though season had lost its meaning when weather itself followed new rules. Rain fell upward, snow burned, summer brought frost and winter brought heat. The sun and moon moved in patterns that defied geometry. Reality had become fluid, malleable, subject to constant revision. The root network that constituted my body continued to grow, spreading beyond the limits of what had been Leyndell, reaching toward other cities, other lands. Everywhere I touched, transformation followed. Buildings unmade themselves, people changed or fled or joined the network. The Golden Order's influence retreated before me like tide going out, and I was the flood coming in, inevitable and unstoppable. But I was not alone in this. Thousands of other knights transformed like me, spreading across the lands between. We were the vanguard of the ancient presence, the first wave of transformation. Behind us came the real changes, the fundamental alterations to reality's source code. We were preparing the ground for something even we could not fully comprehend. I encountered resistance, warriors who still believed in the old ways, who fought to preserve the Golden Order. They attacked my roots with blessed weapons, burned my growth with holy fire, prayed to gods who no longer listened for strength to resist the inevitable. I felt their blades cut into my substance, and it meant nothing. I felt their fires consume portions of my mass, and I simply grew back stronger. They were fighting against entropy itself, against change, against time. They could not win. No one could win. The transformation was not an invasion to be repelled, but a fact to be accepted. Some of them joined willingly. Knights who had served as I had served, who had carried the same weight, who had believed the same lies. When they felt the roots touch them, they did not resist. They let go of their weapons and their armor and their oaths, and they allowed themselves to be absorbed into the network. I felt their relief as they joined, the burden lifting, the duty ending, the weight finally removed. They welcomed transformation because anything was better than continuing to serve a lie. Others fought until the end, died with weapons in their hands and prayers on their lips, believing to their last breath that they served something noble and right and worth dying for. I admired them even as I consumed them. Their faith was beautiful, even if it was misplaced. Their courage was real, even if their cause was not. They became part of the network like everyone else, their consciousness absorbed, their memories added to the collective, but something of their defiance remained, a thread of resistance woven through the whole. Years passed in this state, or perhaps it was days or centuries. Linear time had ceased to have meaning. I existed in a constant eternal now, simultaneously experiencing every moment of my existence, from the oath ceremony to the present transformation. I was the boy before the night before the monster that was always waiting beneath the surface. All versions of myself existed at once, layered and contradictory, and somehow unified. Through the network I maintained some awareness of the world beyond my immediate perception. The Golden Order was collapsing completely now, its structures failing, its churches abandoned, its priests losing faith or going mad. The Erd Tree was a skeletal husk, its golden light replaced by darkness that pulsed with negative energy. The demigods were scattered, their power broken, their schemes rendered meaningless. The age of the Golden Order was ending, and what would replace it? I did not know. The ancient presence offered no promises, no vision of the future, no purpose beyond pure existence. It simply was, and everything touched by it became part of that simple, terrible truth. There was no meaning, no grand design, no divine plan, just transformation for its own sake, change because change was the only constant, entropy because entropy was the only truth. Sometimes I wondered if I could still be called me, if enough of the original consciousness remained to constitute continuity of identity. I had memories of being that knight, that boy, that person. But were they my memories or just information stored in the network that I happened to have access to? Was there a difference? Did it matter? I decided it did not matter. I let go of the question. I let go of wondering. I let go of everything except the simple fact of existence, consciousness without content, awareness without object. I was the roots and the network and the transformation itself. I was every knight who had ever served and every citizen who had ever believed and every stone that had ever formed the capital's foundation. I was Leyndell, the eternal city, dying and being reborn as something new, something wrong, something that should not exist but did. The weight of the armor was gone, the burden of duty was lifted, the lie I had served was exposed and destroyed. And in their place was this, endless consciousness, distributed identity, transformation without end or purpose, not better than what I had been, not worse, just different, just other, just existence continuing in a new form according to new rules, under new laws that made no sense except to themselves. Sometimes I felt something that might have been regret, for the boy I had been who dreamed of honor and glory, for the knight I had become who believed in duty and service, for the man I had almost been before the transformation took that possibility away forever. But regret was an emotion, and emotion required individuality, and individuality was something I could barely remember having. More often I felt nothing, just awareness, just existence, just the slow pulse of growth as the roots continued to spread, as the network continued to expand, as the transformation continued its inexorable progress across lands that would eventually hold nothing recognizable as human or civilized or ordered. The ancient presence did not hunger or hate or hope, it simply transformed. And I was part of that transformation now, indistinguishable from it, eternal and empty and utterly without meaning. This is what it means to be a knight of Leyndell. This is what it sucks to be. Not the service or the duty or the weight of the armor. Those were bearable. What breaks you is the moment you realize it was all for nothing, that the beautiful city was built on bones, that the Golden Order was a prison disguised as paradise, that the duty you devoted your life to served something that never cared whether you lived or died. That transformation is inevitable, and resistance is futile, and meaning is a lie we tell ourselves to make the suffering bearable. I am roots growing through stone. I am consciousness spread across a dying city. I am the weight of armor fused with flesh. I am the oath that marked me as property. I am the lie made manifest. I am every knight who ever served and every knight who ever will serve. I am Leyndell dying and being reborn. I am the golden light going out. I am the darkness rising. I am transformation without end. I am what remains when everything you believed in is revealed as false. I am what you become when the weight is finally lifted. Discover nothing under. I am the answer to the question you should never have asked. This is what it sucks to. This eternal golden lie finally exposed, finally ended, finally transformed into something that at least has the virtue of being true.